By the spring of 1944, something strange was happening across Western Europe. German armies were retreating, surrendering ground, and losing momentum, but not in the way wars were supposed to end. There had been no single, catastrophic battlefield defeat, no encirclement on the scale of Stalingrad, no annihilation visible on the maps that officers studied each night. And yet, division by division, the German war machine was coming apart. To many commanders, this made no sense. The Wehrmacht still possessed experienced officers, disciplined troops, and weapons that, on paper, remained formidable. Veterans of earlier campaigns believed that victory, or at least stabilization, was still possible through tactical brilliance and battlefield skill. They trusted what had carried them through Poland, France, and the early years in the East. War, as they understood it, was decided where soldiers faced one another across fields and rivers. But the irony was already taking shape. The force dismantling the German army was not meeting it head-on. It did not announce itself with artillery barrages or armored breakthroughs. It moved silently, methodically, and without ceremony. The most decisive weapon of 1944 was largely invisible to the men fighting and dying at the front. German frontline units continued to fight with courage and professionalism. They counterattacked when ordered. They held defensive lines under relentless pressure. Yet something felt increasingly hollow. Ammunition arrived late or not at all. Fuel was rationed to the point of paralysis. Replacement troops were scarce, poorly trained, or absent entirely. Orders grew more desperate, even as the means to carry them out steadily vanished. The contrast was stark. Battles were still fought in hedgerows, villages, and ruined cities. But their outcomes were being determined hundreds of miles away, in rail yards, factories, ports, and depots. Decisions made far behind the lines now outweighed anything a battalion commander could accomplish under fire. The front was no longer the center of gravity. It was merely the place where consequences appeared. Slowly, an unsettling truth emerged. Firepower had not failed Germany. Tactics had not suddenly become obsolete. What was collapsing was the system that fed the army its ability to move, supply, repair, and replace. Logistics, not heroism, was deciding the war. And while soldiers scanned the horizon for enemy armor, the real struggle was already unfolding elsewhere quietly, relentlessly, where a different kind of campaign was about to reach its decisive. Within the German high command, confidence lingered long after the foundations of power had begun to erode. Experience, they believed, could still compensate for scarcity. Veteran formations, hardened by years of combat, were expected to overcome material disadvantage through discipline and tactical intuition. Maps continued to show divisions in place, corps aligned, armies intact. On paper, the structure of strength remained reassuring. The shock came not in sudden defeat, but in quiet revelation. Many of those divisions existed only as administrative concepts. Fuel allocations were measured in hours of movement, not days. Ammunition trains failed to arrive. Spare parts were unavailable for vehicles that had already exceeded their intended lifespan. Reports from the front spoke less of enemy pressure than of engines that would not start and guns that could not be fed. The irony was unmistakable. Germany still possessed tanks heavy, well-armed, and technically impressive. But steel without mobility was little more than a monument. Armored units were forced to dig in as static defenses. Their greatest advantage surrendered before the battle began. Crews trained for maneuver warfare now waited beside machines they could no longer move, knowing that superiority meant nothing if it could not reach the point of decision. Commanders adapted as best they could. Artillery officers counted shells with the care of accountants. Panzer leaders planned operations around fuel availability rather than tactical opportunity. Each order carried an unspoken calculation. Not what should be done, but what could still be afforded. War had become an exercise in rationing decline. For the soldiers, the reality was simpler and more severe. Long hours passed without engagement, not because the enemy was absent, but because movement was impossible. Men waited in forests and ruined towns, not for new orders, but for supplies that never came. Hunger, cold, and uncertainty replaced momentum. The war slowed not by choice, but by exhaustion. The illusion of strength persisted in headquarters, sustained by symbols and formations that no longer functioned as intended. Yet beneath the surface, the machinery of war was seizing up. And as German forces stood still, Their enemies were learning something vital: how to turn motion itself into a weapon that would soon decide everything. From the German perspective, the scale of Allied presence in Western Europe felt unreal. Each week brought new formations, fresh equipment, and unfamiliar insignia. Where losses were expected to thin the enemy ranks, the opposite occurred. The destruction of an Allied unit was followed not by absence, but by replacement. What shocked German observers most was not a single landing or offensive, but the continuity of arrival. Many within the German command still believed this flood must be temporary. History suggested that long supply lines were fragile, vulnerable to disruption and exhaustion. The Atlantic, they reasoned, could not sustain such volume indefinitely. Ports would bottleneck, convoys would suffer losses. Somewhere, inevitably, the system would strain and fail. They waited for that moment, convinced that endurance would restore balance. The irony lay in how quickly absence was erased. Allied convoys destroyed at sea were replaced by others already underway. Vehicles knocked out in France were replaced by machines unloaded days later. Ammunition expended in battle was replenished almost as soon as reports were filed. Destruction, once a measure of success, lost its meaning. Losses no longer accumulated. They dissolved. Slowly, German planners began to understand the nature of the enemy they faced. This was not an army advancing alone, but a system, industrial, logistical, and administrative, operating with relentless consistency. Decisions made in American factories translated directly into battlefield presence. Production schedules now shaped front lines. War had expanded beyond generals and soldiers into an equation of output and delivery. The struggle became psychological as much as tactical. German intelligence officers watched charts and estimates climb beyond what could be countered. Even successful engagements no longer altered the strategic picture. Every calculation ended the same way. The enemy would return, stronger than before. The question was no longer how to stop the flow, but how long resistance could matter. The revelation was inescapable. This imbalance was not a phase of the war. It was its defining condition. The Allies were not racing against time, they were aligned with it. And as German forces braced for the next engagement, a quieter realization settled in. The enemy that never stopped arriving had already decided the outcome, long before the final battles were fought. American strategy in the Second World War was shaped by a belief that differed fundamentally from the traditions of European warfare. Victory, U.S. planks, planners concluded, would not be secured through moments of brilliance alone, but through sustained production and dependable delivery. From the beginning, American power was conceived not as a single decisive blow, but as an accumulation measured in tonnage, output, and time. The shock for Germany was realizing that logistics itself had been elevated to the level of a primary weapon. Rail schedules, port capacity, fuel distribution, and repair depots were planned with the same seriousness as offensives and maneuvers. Supply officers held authority once reserved for battlefield commanders. Success was defined not by elegance, but by continuity. What mattered most was not how fast something could be built, but how reliably it could arrive. There was a quiet irony in this approach. The United States did not always field the most refined designs, nor the most technically ambitious weapons. Instead, it produced equipment that could be manufactured in vast numbers, repaired quickly, and operated with minimal disruption. Brilliance gave way to reliability. Complexity was sacrificed in favor of consistency. A system that could endure strain was valued above one that dazzled under ideal conditions. This difference reshaped the nature of the struggle. German forces continued to fight battles seeking tactical advantage, exploiting terrain, relying on experience. American forces, by contrast, fought systems. Every engagement was supported by layers of redundancy. If a bridge was destroyed, another route was ready. If a vehicle broke down, replacements followed. Losses were anticipated, absorbed, and neutralized through planning rather than improvisation. Gradually, the battlefield reflected this philosophy. American units advanced not in dramatic leaps, but in steady pressure. Momentum was maintained even when conditions were unfavorable. What might have halted another army became, for the Americans, an inconvenience to be managed. The war no longer turned on singular acts of genius, but on the ability to persist without interruption. The revelation was stark. War had become a contest of endurance, not inspiration. Victory favored the side that could continue longest, adapt fastest, and replace everything it lost. And as German commanders searched for opportunities to regain initiative, they faced a sobering truth. They were no longer opposing an army alone, but an industrial doctrine that had redefined what winning a war truly meant. To German observers, the speed with which the Allied rear areas transformed was deeply unsettling. Ports damaged by demolition or bombardment were restored with startling efficiency. Depots appeared where farmland had stood only weeks before. Rail hubs were repaired, expanded, and placed into constant operation. Even pipelines, laid across open country, began delivering fuel almost as soon as the front advanced. What shocked German planners was not any single achievement, but the cumulative effect of many working at once. There remained a belief, however, that such complexity would eventually betray itself. The German war effort had long relied on improvisation, assuming that flexibility and experience could overcome structural weakness. American organization, by contrast, was often dismissed as rigid too, dependent on schedules and procedures to survive the chaos of war. It was a misjudgment rooted in unfamiliarity. The irony was that power had shifted away from the traditional centers of command. Supply officers, engineers, and logisticians now shaped the battlefield more decisively than many generals. Their calculations determined when advances could continue and when they would pause. Authority flowed not only from rank, but from the ability to keep men and machines moving. In this quiet reordering, the nature of command itself was changing. For German forces, the struggle became increasingly futile. Every mile of ground conceded did not weaken the enemy, it strengthened him. Roads were improved as they were captured. Rail lines were converted to new gauges. Depots moved forward in rhythm with the advance. The future of each engagement had been planned weeks in advance, long before the first shots were fired. Resistance altered tempo, but not direction. The turning point came with the activation of the Red Ball Express. Beginning in late August 1944, thousands of trucks moved continuously along designated routes, delivering fuel, ammunition, and supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing armies. Day and night, drivers pushed forward, guided by discipline rather than inspiration. Movement became constant, predictable, and unstoppable. The revelation was unavoidable. This was more than transportation. It was sustained motion as a principle of war. While German units waited for fuel that might never arrive, Allied forces advanced with assurance that tomorrow would look much like today, supplied, reinforced, and ready. And as the lines continued to shift eastward, one truth grew clearer. An army that can move without pause cannot be outrun, only endured. For much of the war, Germany had relied on a familiar belief that captured resources and improvisation could offset material weakness. Victories were expected to replenish what the Reich lacked. Fuel would be seized, railways repurposed, factories coerced into service. It was a system born of necessity and sustained by early success, when rapid advances masked the fragility beneath. By 1944, that belief collided with reality. Allied bombing campaigns systematically dismantled the infrastructure that sustained movement marshalling yards, bridges, refineries, and repair facilities. At the same time, the German front stretched farther than it could support. What remained of the supply network was forced to operate under constant disruption. Trains were delayed, rerouted, or destroyed. Roads filled with abandoned vehicles. The shock was not sudden, but cumulative. As each interruption compounded the last, there was a bitter irony in success itself. Tactical victories, when achieved, came at a cost Germany could no longer afford. Counterattacks burned fuel that could not be replaced. Artillery barrages expended shells that factories could not replenish in time. Each local success accelerated strategic exhaustion. Winning a battle now meant losing the capacity to fight the next one. The struggle at the front reflected this decline. Units went into action, uncertain whether resupply would follow. Orders were issued with cautious language, acknowledging limitations once unthinkable. Commanders weighed every movement against the risk of immobilization. Men fought knowing that withdrawal might be impossible not because of the enemy, but because their own machines would be left behind. Gradually, the signs became impossible to ignore. Operational tempo slowed. Gaps appeared between units that could not be closed. Entire formations became static, anchored not by defensive intent, but by empty fuel tanks. Momentum, once the defining strength of German warfare, began to fade not with a decisive blow, but through quiet attrition. The revelation was devastating in its simplicity. Armies do not stop fighting when they are defeated. They stop when they can no longer move. And as German forces struggled to hold ground without the means to maneuver, the war entered a new phase one in which collapse arrived not in chaos, but in stillness, waiting for the final pressure to arrive. By late 1944, the contrast between the two sides of the war had become impossible to ignore. Behind American lines, depots expanded outward like small cities. Crates were stacked in disciplined rows, marked, counted, and already assigned destinations. Fuel flowed through pipelines and storage tanks in quantities that defied earlier assumptions. Food, ammunition, spare parts, everything arrived, not as an emergency measure, but as part of a steady, predictable rhythm. Abundance was no longer exceptional. It was routine. At the German front, the experience could not have been more different. Units waited for resupply that came sporadically, or not at all. Rations were cut. Artillery fire was limited not by opportunity, but by inventory. Vehicles were cannibalized to keep a few running, while the rest were abandoned where they stood. The struggle was no longer only against the enemy, but against absence itself, a slow deprivation that eroded strength before battle was even joined. The irony of this imbalance was profound. For centuries, abundance had been considered a background condition of war, not a weapon in its own right. Yet now, surplus had become decisive. American forces did not merely possess more. They possessed enough to waste, replace, and continue without hesitation. Losses were anticipated and absorbed. What might have crippled another army became a logistical footnote. This pressure reshaped German intentions before they could become action. Planned offensives stalled in the briefing stage, undone by fuel estimates that could not be met. Concentrations of armor existed only in theory, their movement constrained by mathematics rather than enemy fire. Even defensive preparations suffered, as fortifications lacked the materials to be completed and held. War plans collapsed quietly, without ever reaching the battlefield. Behind the Allied lines, the war was being fought differently. Warehouse managers, transport officers, and production planners became the unseen architects of victory. Their decisions determined how fast armies advanced and how long they could sustain pressure. Each pallet unloaded, each convoy dispatched, carried more strategic weight than a successful skirmish. The battlefield was merely the final destination of choices already made elsewhere. Gradually, a new understanding took hold among those still trying to resist. The outcome of the war was being decided not by daring maneuvers or brilliant counterstrokes, but by tonnage, by how many tons of fuel, steel, food, and ammunition could be moved each day without interruption. The side that controlled that flow controlled time itself. And time, once seized, was rarely surrendered. For German soldiers at the front, this realization was unspoken but deeply felt. They could hold ground for a day, sometimes longer. They could inflict losses and delay the inevitable, but they could not reverse a process that renewed itself endlessly behind the enemy's lines. Every engagement began with the same imbalance and ended with the same conclusion. The war, it became clear, was no longer a contest of armies alone. It was a contest of systems, one fed continuously, the other slowly starving. By the final months of the campaign in the West, even Germany's most elite formations were shadows of what they had once been. Units renowned for discipline and battlefield skill continued to hold their positions, but at reduced strength. Veteran soldiers remained, yet their numbers were thin, their equipment worn, and their reserves nearly exhausted. The shock lay in the contrast. Men trained for decisive action, now constrained by conditions they could not influence. For years, German military culture had emphasized experience as a decisive factor. Combat-hardened troops were believed capable of overcoming material inferiority through initiative and cohesion. In earlier campaigns, this belief had been justified. But by 1944, experience alone could no longer compensate for the absence of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. Skill, once a force multiplier, became irrelevant when there was nothing left to multiply. The irony was stark. Experience taught commanders what should be done, but offered no means to do it. They understood terrain, timing, and enemy habits with clarity. Yet tanks could not advance without fuel. Artillery could not prepare attacks without shells. Infantry, however well led, could not maneuver without transport or sustain itself without supplies. Knowledge persisted. Capability did not. Tactical brilliance was tested repeatedly and found wanting not because it failed in concept, but because it collided with emptiness. Counterattacks were planned with precision and then abandoned before execution. When launched, they faltered within miles, engines stalling, formations breaking down under their own logistical weight. Mechanical failure, not enemy resistance, became the primary obstacle. War was being lost, not at the point of contact, but in the moments before it. The turning point came quietly, through repetition. Each failed counterattack reinforced the same lesson. Even when surprise was achieved, momentum evaporated almost immediately. Units that should have exploited breakthroughs were immobilized. Opportunities passed not because they were misjudged, but because they were unreachable. The machinery of war could no longer translate intention into action. For those still fighting, the realization was devastating. Courage remained, skill remained, leadership remained. But these qualities now operated within a vacuum. Logistics had become the invisible hand that erased advantage before it could be applied. What once distinguished elite units from the ordinary was no longer enough to alter outcomes. The revelation was final and unambiguous. Wars are not won by excellence alone. They are won by systems that allow excellence to function. Without fuel, ammunition, and movement, even the most capable forces are reduced to spectators of their own defeat. And as German commanders watched their best units fail for reasons they could neither correct nor control, the conclusion settled in with quiet certainty. Logistics had not merely influenced the war, it had decided it. What remained was not the question of whether defeat would come, but how long skill and sacrifice could delay an end already written far behind the front lines. For generations of soldiers, attrition had carried a simple logic. Losses weakened armies. Men killed or wounded reduced strength. Vehicles destroyed narrowed options. Over time, pressure accumulated until one side could no longer continue. German commanders entered the final phase of the war still guided by this belief, expecting that steady resistance would eventually exhaust the enemy's will and capacity. The shock came as that logic failed to hold. American units absorbed losses and returned to full strength with unnerving speed. Battalions mauled one week reappeared the next with fresh men and equipment. Destroyed vehicles were replaced not after months, but days. Even heavy casualties failed to produce the expected pause. Instead, the tempo of operations remained unchanged, as if loss itself had been anticipated. The irony was cruel and precise. Attrition, once a weapon of desperation, now favored the side that had planned for it in advance. American doctrine assumed loss as a constant, not an exception. Production schedules accounted for destruction. Training pipelines fed replacements forward without interruption. What German planners viewed as success, the infliction of damage was already factored into the enemy's calculations. This realization altered the nature of the struggle. German units fought hard to impose cost, only to watch those costs dissolve into replacement. Each engagement consumed German strength permanently, while American strength regenerated. Time, once neutral, became a hostile force. Every day that passed widened the gap between what could be lost and what could be restored. The revelation was stark. Germany was no longer fighting an army in the traditional sense. It was fighting time itself, time measured in shifts, output quotas, and shipping schedules. The enemy's resilience was not born of fanaticism or luck, but of structure. What had been built could be rebuilt. What had been destroyed could be replaced. Continuity was assured. For soldiers at the front, this understanding settled in slowly. Victories felt smaller. Success carried less meaning. Even moments of local dominance failed to alter the broader picture. The war no longer moved in response to battlefield results, but to industrial rhythm. German effort could delay, but not derail. By late 1944, the implications were unavoidable. Attrition no longer promised relief. It accelerated defeat. Every exchange favored the side that could endure loss without consequence. American strength lay not in invulnerability, but in recovery. The ability to replace everything transformed warfare into an equation Germany could not solve. As German commanders reviewed reports and casualty lists, a final truth emerged. The enemy they faced could afford to lose and still continue. Germany could not. And in that imbalance, the war's outcome was already decided, not by the next battle, but by the relentless passage of time that only one side could master. By the closing months of 1944, the German army confronted a reality that would have seemed unthinkable only years earlier. Units began abandoning vehicles, not because they were damaged, but because there was no fuel to move them. Tanks were blown up by their own crews. Trucks were pushed into ditches and stripped for parts. The shock was not merely material, it was conceptual. An army built on speed and maneuver was being forced into immobility. For a military tradition that had defined itself through movement, the irony was profound. Mechanized warfare without mechanics reduced advanced weapons to burdens. Steel that once represented dominance became dead weight. Engines fell silent, not under enemy fire, but from empty tanks. The tools designed to create momentum now anchored units in place, transforming mobility into liability. This shift marked a decisive turning point. Maneuver, once central to German operational thought, was replaced by retreat. Withdrawals were ordered not to gain advantage, but to avoid encirclement by forces that could move freely. Roads clogged with foot traffic, as vehicles were left behind. Marches replaced advances. The initiative slipped away mile by mile, not seized by the enemy, but surrendered by circumstance. As movement became impossible, defeat began to accelerate. Units that could not reposition were outflanked. Reserves that might have stabilized fronts never arrived. Commanders lost the ability to respond dynamically, forced instead into reactive decisions shaped by scarcity. The battlefield no longer offered choices, only constraints. The revelation was unmistakable. War had reached a phase where outcomes were decided before contact. Without the ability to move, armies ceased to function as cohesive instruments. What remained was resistance without recovery, courage without coordination. German forces continued to fight, but the rhythm of war had turned against them irrevocably. And as the front lines hardened into static positions, another truth became clear. Immobility was not a pause, it was a prelude. When armies stop moving, history begins to move past them. In the winter of 1944, German command placed its remaining hopes in a single belief that surprise could still change everything. If speed and audacity could be restored, even briefly, the war's direction might yet be altered. The Ardennes offensive was conceived not as a prolonged campaign, but as a decisive rupture, an operation designed to unbalance the enemy before material superiority could assert itself. The plan depended on secrecy, concentration, and rapid movement. German forces would strike through terrain the Allies considered unsuitable for large-scale attack, aiming to split enemy lines and seize critical crossings. For a moment, the familiar language of maneuver warfare returned to German headquarters. Maps were marked with arrows pointing west, as if momentum itself could be summoned by intent. The shock lay in what was already missing. Fuel reserves were dangerously thin before the first unit moved. The offensive relied on strict consumption limits and optimistic assumptions. Vehicles were issued barely enough gasoline to reach their initial objectives. From the outset, success depended not on what Germany possessed, but on what it hoped to capture. Here, the irony reached its sharpest edge. Victory no longer hinged on defeating enemy formations, but on finding Allied fuel depots intact. Armored thrusts advanced with empty margins, their commanders acutely aware that every mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. The offensive was not powered from within. It was borrowing its future from the enemy. As the attack began, initial gains seemed to vindicate the gamble. Allied units were caught off guard, roads filled with retreating traffic. For a brief moment, movement returned. But beneath the surface, the same constraints tightened. Traffic jams formed as vehicles stalled or broke down. Fuel trucks failed to arrive. Schedules slipped, and with them, the fragile arithmetic of the plan. The turning point came not with a dramatic clash, but with silence. Engines stopped running. Columns halted in forests and villages, waiting for fuel that did not come. Captured depots were smaller than expected or already destroyed. Momentum drained away mile by mile, not under enemy fire, but under the weight of logistical reality. As the offensive stalled, its collapse unfolded quietly. Units withdrew without decisive engagement, conserving what little mobility remained. The ambition that had driven the plan dissolved into caution. What had been envisioned as a sweeping maneuver became a static struggle, indistinguishable from the condition it had sought to escape. The revelation was unavoidable. The outcome had been determined before the first shot was fired. No amount of surprise could overcome the absence of supply. Logistics had already set the limits of possibility. The Ardennes was not lost because of tactical error or lack of resolve. but because its premise depended on resources that no longer existed. In the end, the offensive achieved only one thing with certainty. It confirmed that the war could no longer be shaped by imagination alone. As German forces fell back once more, the illusion finally broke. The conflict was no longer decided by where armies struck, but by what sustained them. And long before contact was made in the snow-covered forests, that decision had already been reached far behind the lines, where movement was measured not in courage, but in fuel. By early 1945, the German army had not been destroyed in the manner history often expects. There was no single moment of annihilation, no final encirclement that erased it from the field. Instead, formations began to disintegrate structurally. Units still existed, soldiers still stood in ranks, but the connective tissue that allowed an army to function had quietly failed. The shock lay in how intact the surface appeared, even as coherence vanished beneath it. Morale, contrary to expectation, was not the primary cause. Many soldiers remained willing to fight. Discipline endured in pockets. Orders were still issued and, when possible, obeyed. The irony was painful. The men were present, but the systems that sustained them were not. An army cannot operate on resolve alone. Without movement, communication, and supply, willingness becomes irrelevant. This breakdown marked a critical turning point. Command structures lost their ability to exert control over events. Headquarters issued directives that could not be executed. Units moved or failed to move based not on intent, but on chance. Lines blurred as formations became isolated, unable to coordinate with neighbors or higher command. Authority persisted in theory, but not in effect. The loss of control was gradual and uneven. Some units continued to fight effectively for days or weeks, while others dissolved almost overnight. The difference lay not in leadership or courage, but in access to fuel, ammunition, and transport. Where systems functioned, resistance continued. Where they failed, collapse followed quietly, without drama or panic. The revelation was stark and unsettling. Armies do not cease to exist when they are morally broken. They cease to exist when they can no longer perform the basic functions of war. Communication faltered. Supply ceased. Mobility vanished. What remained were armed groups acting independently, no longer part of a coherent whole. This form of collapse left little visible drama. There were no mass surrenders in open fields, no sweeping gestures of defeat. Instead, there was stillness. Columns halted by empty tanks. Units waiting for orders that never arrived. Commanders making decisions that carried no practical consequence. The machinery of war simply stopped responding. In this final stage, the war revealed its most sobering truth. Victory and defeat are not always dramatic. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through the failure of systems that once seemed permanent. The German army did not fall because its soldiers lost the will to fight. It fell because it lost the ability to function. And as Allied forces advanced into a landscape filled with weapons that could no longer be used and units that could no longer act, the meaning of collapse became clear. An army had been defeated without being annihilated undone, not by a final blow, but by the slow, irreversible breakdown of everything that made it an army at all. In the final months of the war in the West, Germany experienced a form of defeat that defied historical expectation. There was no single front that collapsed catastrophically. No vast encirclement that sealed the army's fate in one decisive movement. Instead, retreat unfolded everywhere at once. Units pulled back across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, not in panic, but in resignation. The consequence was unmistakable. An army withdrawing in all directions without a center strong enough to hold. The irony was that no single disaster could be named as the cause. There was no moment comparable to earlier annihilations, no battle that alone explained what followed. Each withdrawal appeared justified, each decision rational in isolation. Yet together, they formed a pattern of cumulative failure. Every retreat weakened the next position. Every abandoned depot narrowed future options. The war was being lost not by one overwhelming blow, but by the steady erosion of possibility. This form of defeat was shaped by logistics rather than maneuver. German units did not withdraw because they were surrounded, but because remaining in place offered no future. Supply lines no longer functioned reliably. Movement was restricted or impossible. Holding ground consumed resources that could not be replaced. Retreat became the only viable action, even when no immediate enemy pressure demanded it. As this pattern spread, strategic coherence dissolved. Withdrawals were conducted simultaneously across vast distances, with little coordination beyond local necessity. There was no opportunity to regroup, no reserve strong enough to restore balance. Each step back reduced the ability to resist elsewhere. The front no longer bent, it receded. The revelation lay in understanding what had truly occurred. Logistics had delivered strategic death without spectacle. It had removed the capacity to choose when and where to fight. Armies depend on the ability to concentrate strength. When supply collapses, concentration becomes impossible. What remains is dispersion, retreat, and inevitability. German commanders recognized this too late. Even where defenses held temporarily, they lacked depth. Success could not be reinforced. Failure could not be corrected. The war's outcome was no longer responsive to leadership or courage. It followed the logic of supply, indifferent to intention. For soldiers on the ground, the experience was disorienting. There was no final stand, no clear boundary marking defeat. Instead, there was motion without direction, marches away from positions that could not be held, toward others that offered no promise. The war faded from active struggle into managed withdrawal. In this way, Germany was defeated without encirclement, without annihilation, and without drama. The end came not as a crash, but as a quiet subtraction of fuel, of ammunition, of mobility, of time. Logistics did not merely support the enemy's advance. It ensured that resistance could no longer shape events. And as the retreat continued toward the Reich itself, one truth stood above all others. The war had already been decided long before the final borders were crossed. The machinery that sustains armies had failed, and with it, the ability to resist history's forward motion. Far from the front lines, beyond the sound of artillery and the reach of headlines, another war unfolded quiet, methodical, and decisive. It was fought not by infantry or armor, but by truck drivers navigating ruined roads, clerks tracking inventories by hand, and engineers rebuilding bridges faster than they could be destroyed. These men and women rarely appeared in after-action reports, yet their labor shaped every outcome that followed. The human element of this hidden war was unglamorous and relentless. Drivers worked through exhaustion, steering overloaded trucks day and night, often without rest or recognition. Clerks processed endless streams of paperwork, ensuring that the right supplies reached the right unit at the right moment. Engineers labored under pressure, repairing ports, railways, and roads with speed that bordered on routine. None of it resembled heroism in the traditional sense. All of it was indispensable. The irony was unmistakable. The least visible effort proved the most decisive. Battles captured attention, but they consumed what logistics provided. Every advance depended on calculations made far behind the lines. Every success rested on schedules, quotas, and coordination. Victory emerged not from dramatic confrontation alone, but from consistency sustained over time. This reality revealed a deeper transformation in the nature of war. Modern conflict had become managerial. Decisions were increasingly shaped by capacity, flow, and maintenance rather than by individual brilliance. The question was no longer who fought better, but who organized better. The battlefield became the final expression of systems already in motion. For Germany, this shift proved fatal. Its military culture prized initiative and tactical skill, but struggled to match the scale and discipline of Allied organization. Where the Allies emphasized redundancy and planning, Germany relied on improvisation. In earlier years, that difference had been masked by success. By 1944, it defined failure. The revelation extended beyond this single conflict. The Second World War demonstrated that modern wars are won long before combat begins by those who build structures capable of absorbing loss, sustaining effort, and maintaining momentum. The soldiers at the front remained essential, but they no longer determined outcomes alone. They acted within frameworks designed by others, far removed from the fighting. As the war drew to a close, the contrast was complete. One side collapsed despite courage and experience. The other advanced steadily, powered by organization rather than inspiration. The decisive victories had already occurred in offices, depots, and planning rooms, where the war behind the war had been fought without pause. And as history moved on, one lesson endured with quiet clarity. In the modern age, wars are not only battles of men and machines, but contests of management itself. The side that masters that invisible struggle writes the ending often long before the last shot is fired. In the end, Germany was not defeated in the way its soldiers had been trained to expect. There was no final, decisive clash in the West that shattered its remaining forces in a single blow. Instead, the outcome had already been sealed long before the guns began to fall silent. Germany prepared to fight battles. America prepared to supply them. This difference defined the war's conclusion. German planning centered on engagement on maneuver, surprise, and tactical resolution. Victory was imagined as something seized at the front. American planning, by contrast, assumed that battles were inevitable, costly, and repetitive. Its focus lay elsewhere, on ensuring that every loss could be replaced, every advance sustained, and every setback absorbed without collapse. The moral weight of this contrast is difficult to ignore. Courage, skill, and sacrifice were present on all sides. German soldiers fought with discipline even as conditions worsened, yet courage alone could not overcome empty fuel tanks or silent supply lines. Industry and organization did not diminish bravery, they rendered it insufficient. In modern war, valor requires a system to give it meaning. This was the final irony of the conflict. Germany lost not because its soldiers lacked will, but because the structure behind them failed. America won not because its soldiers fought harder, but because the framework supporting them never stopped working. The decisive advantage lay not in individual moments of heroism, but in the ability to sustain effort without interruption. As the war closed, the pattern became unmistakable. German resistance faded unevenly, not in response to dramatic defeats, but as resources vanished. American forces continued forward with steady inevitability, their momentum uninterrupted by losses that would have crippled another army. The battlefield reflected choices made years earlier, in factories, shipyards, and planning offices far from the front. This realization offers a sobering reflection on the nature of modern conflict. War is no longer decided solely by those who fight it, but by those who organize it. The unseen labor of production, transportation, and coordination shapes outcomes as surely as any weapon. What appears sudden at the front is often the delayed result of preparation elsewhere. Germany's defeat, then, was not the failure of its soldiers, but the failure of its systems. It was beaten without being shot in countless moments when a train did not arrive, when a depot stood empty, when a vehicle could not move. Each of these moments carried more weight than a lost skirmish. Together, they determined the war's end. And when the fighting finally stopped, the lesson remained. The guns fell silent only after the warehouses